All right, now we're having a little bit of a transition in this class. So think of where we've been. We talked about worldviews, kind of evaluating worldviews, inter-theology stuff. Talked about God reveals himself. And then we talked quite a bit about God's attributes. So he has all these different things that we want to say. He's all good, he's all powerful, all these things, right? But these attributes give us a number of questions, right? So we work through these questions about providence, we work through questions about human freedom and how that works in divine foreknowledge, and then of course the problem of evil. So we're coming to the end of the time where we've been working through those questions, and now we're kind of moving on in doctrinal issues. So God exists, of course, but he chose to create us. So doctrine of creation, that's where we're at. Of course, the question of creation evolution is a big deal here. We'll talk about that. But that's not the only question. So before we get to that, there's a number of what I'm going to call important theological aspects of creation. There's key ideas within this concept of creation that are pretty important. So let me just mention a few of these. Probably the most important, a really important theological concept is the fact that creation is ex nihilo, or out of nothing. This is unlike other creation stories. You probably are aware that every society has their creation stories. One that maybe the best known is the Babylonian creation epic called Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is an example of creation, but it's not creation ex nihilo. So one god kills another god and uses that god's dead body to create the world, right? So that's creation out of pre-existent stuff. When I build stuff, when I build cabinets, I have to go to the store and I have to buy wood to do that. So that's not creation ex nihilo. When God created creation ex nihilo, there was nothing, and bang, there was something, right? So creation out of nothing. Now this is important because it kind of splits the horns between a number of, couple different views. So this is creation ex nihilo is a denial of metaphysical monism. So creation is a part of God. So that would be where God creates within his own being, right? We're within God's being. That would be kind of a pantheistic, or what's known as a panentheistic view. So this is not that. God created something outside of himself, created out of nothing. This also denies metaphysical dualism, that the world and God kind of exist eternally, right? In this, they've always existed. So creation, the world, the material world has always been. That's not the case either. So creation ex nihilo both denies metaphysical monism and metaphysical dualism. Second key idea that's important for us to talk about is that creation is very good. But amongst creation, human beings are unique. So God created creation. When he saw it, he says, and it was very good, right? So this is God's work. This is God's, you want to say it, this is God's handiwork. This is his art. He loves what he has created, and he gave human beings a unique place within that creation. But our uniqueness is not then, well, we can do whatever the heck we want with creation and destroy it if we wish. Our uniqueness comes from the fact that he gave us responsibility for creation, to care for and protect creation. So people that say that we have dominion over creation, that we can do whatever we want, the Hebrew word for us supposedly having dominion over creation is the same word that I'm supposed to have dominion over my children. I'm supposed to care for them. I'm supposed to love them. I'm supposed to protect them. And that's our responsibility with creation as well. Third, the doctrine of preservation. Colossians 1 has this idea that God is not only creates, but he's an ongoing holding it in being. So not only did he create, but that he holds creation in being. So here's an analogy, way of thinking about this. Creation is like a thought in God's mind, that were he to cease to think it, we would cease to be. Now, that's not literal, we're not actually thoughts, right? But that shows the sort of reliance on God in an ongoing way for our existence that I think is appropriate given what Scripture says about creation. So not only did he create, he sustains the creation in being. Now, of course, creation evolution debate is a big deal here. And really the problem is this. How do we reconcile the fact that we Christians believe, and we think Scripture teaches, that God created, with what we also believe from contemporary science. And those who say we just want to throw out science, well, they should stop driving cars and driving across bridges and things like that, because, of course, we trust these things and we think that they are, science gives us true things about the world. So it seems like, science is telling us some things. How do we reconcile that with what we think we're getting from Scripture, right? So let's talk a little bit about what contemporary science says. So the origin of the universe according to contemporary science, and of course there's disagreements on this among scientists, but rough, big picture idea. The universe began 12 to 15 billion years ago in a Big Bang. So a cosmic singularity, this huge event that was the origin of the material universe. And then life began as single-celled organisms on at least one planet, if not more than one, and that all life that we see today, with everything, human beings, orangutans, koala bears, right? All life came from those organisms via the mechanisms of evolution. So that's what the contemporary science thinks, right? So this then creates two problems for us, two different questions, and contemporary science raises these two questions for us. The first of that is, what does the Bible say about when the earth created? Because of course, this contemporary science, the answer of contemporary science is the earth is very, very old. So can we Christians agree with that or not? So what does the Bible say about when the earth was created? And then what should we think about how the earth was created? Is there anything theologically that requires us to believe one thing or another thing in terms of how the earth was created? So these are two different questions. I'll call them the when question and the how question. When question first. How old is creation? How long ago did God create? Is creation very, very young? Is creation as old as science seems to suggest it is? And I'm going to give you four different views, four different possible answers to this question. The first view is boringly but aptly titled the young earth view. The universe is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and the young earth people articulate or have the belief that creation is in 6 24-hour periods, right? So the days of creation are literal 24-hour days. Right now, how would you get to the idea that the earth is very, very young just from Genesis 1 and 2? Well, you don't, right? Because Genesis 1 and 2 says they're like literal days, but those literal days could have been billions of years ago for all we know. So the young earth theorists suggest that they can determine the earth is very, very young by using the Genesis genealogies. The Genesis genealogies, you basically start with a particular date for Abraham, and then in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, it gives like how long these people were around, and they can specify roughly the date of creation. So kind of an extreme example of this, the Archbishop James Ussher posited that based doing these calculations that creation occurred on October 23rd in 4004 BC. And there are various ways, and a lot of it depends on just when you have understand Abraham as being born, or when he was around, but so that roughly, that's a pretty rough number. Now the question is, why does creation look older? For those that claim the earth is very, very young, it doesn't take rocket scientists to go out and say, well, looks kind of old to me. The Grand Canyon. There's, why are some things the way they are? There's some things that make it look quite a bit older. And what the young earth theorists posits, there's two kind of broad kind of answers that they give for that. The first is they say that creation looks much older because of the effects of the universal flood. So the flood really, really messed up things and made it look much older than it otherwise would have. The second possibility is that creation was with appearance of age. So, I'll give you an example. If God created an oak tree on day one, if you cut down that oak tree, it would have probably, ostensibly, would have lines, making it look like it'd been around for like 10 years or 20 years or whatever else. That's creation with the appearance of age. If God created an oak tree right, then it would seem like you'd probably have these lines. So it's the appearance that had been around longer, but he just created day one. He just created the oak tree. Example of stars that are 10,000 light years away, right? If he would have created just the star out there, right, then all that light would have taken all this time to get here, and it would have arrived just maybe recently, right? And we would see stars kind of blink on because the light would finally get there. But we don't think that. What we think is God created the star and all the light already there. So like on day one, people on earth could see all that light. So that is an idea of creation with the appearance of age. So young earth theorists posit this idea that God created the world looking old. So he created the world with various layers of sediment, looking like they've been laid down over billions of years, but maybe he just created them as it is. So that's how young earth theorists deal with this problem. Second possibility is called the gap theory. The gap theory, I call it a have your cake and eat it too view, because it allows them to say the earth is very, very old, but it also allows them to be pretty literal with the Genesis account, the days of creation. So what these theorists posit is that there was an original creation and then a long gap of time and then a recent restoration. And so not literally a recreation, because it's not creation ex nihilo. It's kind of fixing what's been messed up. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And then the gap theorists translate the next word, and then the earth became formless and void, implying that something sort of happened to it that messed it up. And what they posit is that's when Satan fell, was kicked out of heaven, came down to earth, and messed up all of creation. And then God just sat on it for maybe billions of years. Did nothing. And then very recently, he worked to restore creation. So this restoration of creation occurred in 6 literal 24-hour periods. So is Earth very, very old? Yes. There's some things that even look very, very old. Well, that's from the original creation. But then God has done this process of restoration very, very recently, maybe as recently as 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. So gap theory. Third view is called the day-age theory. The day-age theory is an older view. The process of creation took a very long time, and it happened in stages. It happened over time. So while the days of creation in Genesis 1 and 2 are chronological, they're not literal 24-hour days. So, there's stuff created at this time, at this time, at this time, but those times are not literal days. Now you might say, well, God says, on the first day God created. And the answer to that, the day-age theorists give, is that the word yom, which is Hebrew for day, can also mean age or long period of time. So in the yom of King David didn't exist for just a day. It also can mean a long period of time. So these people argue that it could mean literally billions of years. The last view is called the literary framework view, and this view is called literary framework because it points to the some literary aspects of Genesis 1 and 2. And the argument here is the Bible does not give a chronology of creation. So when did creation happen? This view says we have no idea. Scripture doesn't talk about it at all. So you might say, well, what on earth does Genesis 1 and 2 try to do then? It tries to teach us, according to this view, that God created, but it doesn't try to say anything about how he did it. So the purpose of Genesis is to tell us about God, not to tell us specifics about creation. In particular, the purpose of Genesis is a polemic. So it tells us about God and how he is more powerful than all the other beings. So a polemic is an argument against something. And in this case, this is an argument against polytheism. So think of the things that are in Genesis 1, saying God created this, and God created that. So God created the sun, God created the stars. Everything that's in Genesis 1, there is a corresponding deity that people in the ancient Near East would have been aware of. So sun gods, gods, Zoroastrianism, the gods of the stars and gods of the fertility cults, so the vegetation of the land. So really the purpose of Genesis 1 and 2 was to allow ancient Israelites to look at their neighbors and say, you think your God's so great? My God created your God, right? So it's a statement about God and a statement that he created and that he is over all the other gods. And the other thing is that the structure of Genesis is very clearly poetic, not chronological. So this is the other thing the literary framework view will point out. There's a poetic structure to Genesis 1. So if you look at Genesis, the day 1, 2, and 3, there's a really interesting parallelism between days for that, the 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, and 6. So on day 1, it says, in the beginning, God created and he separated. So it talks about how he separates the water from the air, right? And then on the other half, on that parallelism, then he creates fish in the water and birds in the air. On day 1, it talks about he creates light, right? But interestingly, the sun doesn't show up and the stars don't show up and the moon doesn't show up until day 4. So the parallelism between days 1, 2, 3 and days 4, 5, 6. So literary framework views it's probably people who hold it. It would hold to an old earth view, but it actually says Scripture doesn't tell us anything about this view. So 4 different possibilities. Certainly the traditional view is the young earth view. I myself have a pretty strong preference for the literary framework view because when people try to use Scripture to say, well, the creation was at this time, I just don't think God was trying to teach us that. All right, the how question. This is really the creation evolution debate proper. Can we as Christians accept evolution? And there's a variety of issues here. Let me sketch some of the issues. There are 2 key issues that we have to think about before we talk about the different views. The first is when God acted, did he act kind of all at once or did he act over time, over a long, long period of time? So think of it, a person who builds a house, they like put it all up, and it may take them a month and a half to do it or something like that. That's a single event, right? Or, you build a little bit of a house and then like 10 years later you add on to the house and then 10 years later you add on to the house. That's like multiple events. So was God's creation single event or multiple events? Was it kind of more or less all in one sort of big creative event, or did it happen a little bit at a time? The second question is there common ancestry between species? And here we have 3 possibilities, right? Some people just flat out deny evolution, say there's no such thing. There's no evolutionary links. Evolution does not happen. So God directly creates every single species. All of the million species of spiders, he directly and specifically created every one. Evolution does not happen. Second possibility is what's called microevolution. And that is that God directly creates classes or types and then allows evolution to create different versions of that type. So for example, just an example, God created carnivores and then used evolution to create specific species, everything from lions to wolves to Pekingese, right? These are evolution creates different species, right? But God created the big picture types. Right. The last view is called macroevolution. Macroevolution basically says we all came from the same we're all in the same evolutionary tree. So there's single-celled life, and we all have evolved from that single-celled life. So 3 different possibilities, 2 key issues, and 3 different possibilities on that last one. Let's then look at the views that we can have with respect to these 2 issues. The first view is called fiat creationism. When something happens by fiat, it happens, boom, done, right? So there's kings used to do things by fiat command. They would say it and it would happen, right? So on this view, fiat creationism, God, made creation happen in a single event. Now, this view, of course, is very compatible with the young earth view. It says this was very, very recent. And that the 6 days of creation is this single event, where God chose to create this world, and after this, he's done, right? There's no need for evolution because he directly creates everything that exists. Second view is called progressive creationism. Now we have multiple events. So think of the day-age theory. The day-age theory, there's a big long period of time. Day one is this long, maybe billions of years. Day two is also, maybe billions of years long. So God creates in multiple events, but there's no evolution going on between. So creates the Big Bang, right? And then steps in later and creates planets, and then steps in later and creates vegetation, and then billion years later creates human beings, right? So there's no evolution in between stages, but there's these different stages or events in which he's creating. Evolutionary creationism is also multiple event. So think of the example I just used. So God steps in and he creates something, but then he uses this mechanism of evolution that he's created to continue to create aspects. So he steps in and creates, say, plant life, but then he allows evolution to create lots of different kinds of plant life. And then later in, he steps in and creates animals and allows evolution to create lots of different kinds of animals, right? And then later, maybe last, he steps in and creates, especially creates human beings, right? So there's there's multiple events, and there's evolution is at work, but it's not macroevolution. That's the last view. Macroevolution is the view that holds that. It's called strict theistic evolution. So it's not just saying there is some evolution. It means everything has evolved. So it's actually back to a single event. God snaps his fingers, Big Bang happens, and that the natural processes of evolution bring about everything. He doesn't need to step in and create in any additional stages. There's only one creative act, and then everything else comes out from that. So 4 different views on how God creates. Of course, these are connected with the 4 different views on when. They're both important questions and worth engaging.